First, I should like to thank James Orr and the organization of this conference for having invited me here today. It's a great honor, but I should disavow, perhaps strangely in the circumstances, any expertise in politics, either practical or theoretical. I'll merely offer you some observations which I hope will not strike you as completely random. For some years, I had the opportunity to delve a little into the educational attainments of young people aged 16 to 25. And I must here enter two caveats. First, my sample, though it was not small, was a selected one, and secondly, it is now from some time ago. But I rather doubt that things have changed very much since, and certainly not for the better, though at the same time they could hardly have been worse. The majority of the people whom I met could hardly read and write with facility. They would point to a word, I would give them a sentence, they would point to a word and say, "I don't know that one," as if English were written ideographically. When they struggled to the end of a sentence, I would ask them what it had meant, and many of them would say, "I don't know, I was only reading it." As if reading were a kind of propitiatory ceremony to ward off some evil. As to arithmetic, it was not much better. When, for example, I asked them to multiply 6 by 7, they would be very pleased when I told them that they had got it nearly right. That seemed to them adequate. And the nadir, perhaps, was when I asked someone to multiply 3 by 4, to which the reply was, "We didn't get that far." Now, two things here should be noticed. First, that these young people were not of defective intelligence, and the second is that they had been in receipt of an education which had cost perhaps £60,000. You had to admire it in a way. Never in human history had so little been imparted to so many at such great expense. Well, in the circumstances, it will not surprise you that their knowledge of history was not extensive. In 15 years, I encountered 3 who could tell me the dates of the Second World War. I thought it a tribute to our educational system, both in its historical and mathematical departments, that one of them deduced from the fact that there was a Second World War that there must have been a first, though he didn't actually know when it took place. Asked to name a British Prime Minister other than the present one and Mrs. Thatcher, they'd all heard of Mrs. Thatcher as people have heard of the devil, without necessarily having religious belief. The most common reply was something like, "I don't know, I wasn't born then." Now, this seemed to me a highly significant answer, but also a disastrous one. Disastrous for them personally and for our society as a whole. It implied that they lived in a kind of present disconnected from any past, like human particles in Brownian motion. They had and could have no ambition to contribute, in no matter how humble a way, to a collective endeavor or tradition, for they knew nothing of such a thing. But of course, they were not alone in this. Disconnection from the past is almost a feature of our age. A patient who was an art student told me that she was discontented with her course in an art school because it had the quality of a kindergarten about it. But she said she liked art history. I was interested to know what they taught in art history in our art schools. She said, "Last year we did African art, but this year we're doing Western art." I said, "Oh, yes. What exactly?" She said, "Roy Lichtenstein." So art in the West began with Roy Lichtenstein. No doubt in 20 years' time it will be found really to have begun with Damien Hirst. Our towns and cities bespeak of a contempt for and even hatred of the past. There's hardly one that has not been ruined by at least one strategically placed modernist building, and usually by many. In scores of places, the prospect of a medieval building has been assaulted, as it were, by some concrete, steel, or glass monstrosity, indeed with such regularity that it surely can't be a coincidence. The past is not ignored, it is hated. There was a recent scandal over the renaming of the Hume Tower at Edinburgh University because of a sentence Hume wrote a quarter of a millennium ago. But the real scandal was missed. The real scandal of David Hume Tower was that it was built in the first place. One consequence of all this is the extraordinary pridelessness in much of British life, give or take a royal funeral or coronation. It's present or visible in many small things. You can see it as you walk down the street. And when contractors finish repairing a road in Britain, they do not clear up after themselves, as they seem to do in other countries, and as they once did here. They leave sandbags, rusted metal frame notices, often upturned like iron beetles with their legs in the air, and plastic orange and white cones by the side of the road, tipped up and growing ever dirtier. It's a very small thing, but I ask you to think about it, what it actually means. Surely it means that the contractors and their staff have no real pride in their work. They're not contributing to anything. They merely want to be paid. It also means that whoever has contracted them to do the work didn't demand that they cleared up after them. It was too much trouble for whoever was responsible to do that. Local councils do nothing in this regard, and I'm not making a party political point. It seems to be general in the country. In short, no one cares or possesses the competence to do anything about it. If you look at our police, what do you see? Is there any pride in the uniform that they wear? How could there be? Increasingly, they look not like citizens in uniform. They've nothing to do with Sir Robert Peel, but a fascist paramilitary militia with all the paraphernalia of repression dangling about them, which fortunately many of them are too fat to use. They have taken the general confession of the Book of Common Prayer. We have left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we have done those things which we ought not to have done. They've taken this not as a confession, but as a blueprint. And I must say that for once in our fatuous target-setting culture, they seem to have succeeded in this. Not surprisingly, given the official guidance given them. I'll here quote the guidance on what is called, this is the official guidance, on what is called a non-crime hate incident. A non-crime hate incident, NCHI, means an incident or alleged incident which involves or is alleged to involve an act by a person, the subject, which is perceived by a person other than the subject to be motivated wholly or partly by hostility or prejudice towards persons with a particular characteristic. Well, where is the free-born Englishman in all this? In what kind of country is an alleged incident an incident? Moreover, one that deserves the attention of a policeman, and in which any perception, no matter how unjustified or even mad, is worthy of being taken as evidence. Perceptions of motivations, I'm a psychiatrist. I could never perceive motivations. Our architecture is totalitarian. The totalitarian leanings, both of communist and fascist, of the founders of modernist architecture are insufficiently appreciated or understood. And now our police are being expected to become totalitarian too. The words that I have quoted from the official guidance on non-crime hate incidents did not write themselves. Indeed, I suspect that ChatGPT would have done a better job. Goodness knows how many urgent meetings, how many years of education were necessary to produce them. They're from this year, incidentally, 2023. But speaking personally, I should be ashamed to be in charge of an organization that could produce such an appalling, vicious, dangerous document that will and is intended to turn us into a nation either of eggshells or of snitches, or both. And though I hesitate to mention it in this company, this has been promulgated under a Conservative government which ought to be ashamed of itself. It's not as if there were not enough crimes for the police to be getting on with. 5.3 million of them, in fact, last year in England and Wales, of which a princely 5.6% ended in a charge, not necessarily a conviction. And this figure is hardly surprising, given the enormous efforts the police go to, which I have witnessed myself, or which are imposed on them by officialdom, to avoid doing anything. An elderly friend of mine was recently the object of a crime that could easily have ended in his death. The efforts made by the police not to clear up or even to record this crime were comical in their Byzantine complexity, involving many police departments with names that conveyed no meaning to normal citizens. If there were any justice in the world, many of our police, especially our senior police officers, would be arrested for wasting police time. This particular pathology, this making work while avoiding work at the same time, and even preventing work, it sometimes seems as if we're looking through the looking glass, a world in which, for example, the police protect our feelings but not our property, are shepherds to us all but indifferent to wolves. Let me give you a vignette of this looking glass Kafkaesque catch-22 world that many people now feel we live in. Last Friday, I went to my bank, 16 miles away. Incidentally, banks are not much better than the government. In fact, in some respects, they're worse. And I had to go there in person because the bank would not allow me to contact it in any other way other than personally. There was a lady there in her late 60s in a wheelchair, pushed by her husband behind me in the queue. The osteoarthritis of her hip was now so bad that she could no longer walk more than a step or two. She had been told that her hip replacement could not be done for at least 2 years. And it was highly likely, from my experience with the National Health Service, that she would have many postponements of her operation once she was told that it was about to take place. On the other hand, she was refused a disabling parking permit by the state or by an agent of the state because her condition was curable. In other words, the state refuses something to her because it refuses to cure her curable condition or is incapable of doing so. As the Austrians used to say in the days of their defunct empire, the situation is catastrophic but not serious. Well, imagine being a bureaucrat denying this lady, in accordance with some rules, something that any normal person would grant immediately without any further thought, while knowing at the same time that fraud on a vast scale was being perpetrated on the system every day. Could you take pride in what you're doing? It's important that pride, so this is why it is important to have a history in which you can have some pride. Montaigne's friend, Etienne de la Boétie, wrote a discourse on voluntary servitude, in which he claimed that tyrants depended upon the willing servitude of the population and could not stay in power without it. Well, we seem to have discovered something new: voluntary stupidity. Stupidity in the bureaucratic context has one great advantage, that it creates endless opportunities for what is sometimes called work, though perhaps it should be called activity. Impelling this stupidity lies fear that without it, employment would evaporate. There's no belief in the future because there's no pride in or respect for the past. All you can hope for is whatever advantage or privileges you can extract or garner at the moment. The thoroughness with which pride in the past, or even in institutions, as a potential threat to the apparatchik and nomenclatura class, is illustrated by the way a single logo was imposed upon all hospitals in the National Health Service. It's a very small thing. It was first to give the illusion that all hospitals are equal, which cannot be so, nor should it be so. And second, to weaken local loyalties, for the locally loyal tend to be the awkward squad. They're very difficult to control. The problems that we face are not unique to us. I regularly read about the same woes in our nearest neighbor, France. Educational levels there have fallen drastically despite, and one is sometimes tempted to say because of, the unprecedented high levels of expenditure on it. The present Minister of Education there seems to be responding to the problems in the same way that some people here would like to respond to problems. The imposition of the same low standards on private schools, if not their outright abolition. Here I quote a phrase from last Friday's Figaro with regard to something that the author called the deep state, which explains why we seem to be on a huge ship whose direction it's so difficult to change. The multiplication of independent administrative authorities, which come to make themselves independent of politics and even to replace them, in the name of an expertocracy that is judged superior. The fears of disintegration in France are as great as they are here, and they are all for very similar reasons. I think that they are just a few years behind us in this respect. I don't have any solution to offer and no recipe for making whole eggs out of those that have been scrambled. To try to restore pride by government decree and bureaucracy, say through a curriculum in history, is obviously dangerous and in any case destined to fail. Any regeneration, I'm afraid, has to be slow and voluntary. And that's why it is so necessary, essential, constantly to expose the lies of the little emperors with no clothes who rule us. Thank you very much.